Gojo vs Sukuna has been one of the most anticipated and built up fights, not just in Jujutsu Kaisen, but in recent shonen manga, period. The expectations that were placed on this fight by both the narrative and fans alike was absolutely insane. And while it definitely lived up to some of these expectations, in other areas this fight simply couldn't compete with the hype ascribed to it. In this video, I'll be taking a look at this fight in a holistic sense, not to merely explain or recount the events that you've already seen in the manga, but to analyze it, dissect it, break it down, and by the end of this video, hopefully give you a better understanding of the possible problems and beauty that this fight has as we look at Gojo versus Sukuna. The good, the bad, and the strongest. Gojo vs Sukuna, like most real conflicts in manga, didn't just start when the two characters actually began throwing hands. The beginning of this fight, or rather, the beginning of their battle, truly started in the second chapter of the manga. From their first meeting, the expectation was established that these two characters would butt heads once again in a much more concrete sense, and that clash would be absolutely insane in terms of its scope and scale. Chapter 3 continues this build-up by establishing even further just how confident and powerful both characters involved in this conflict were. Ryomen Sukuna, the king of curses, the strongest sorcerer in the golden age of Jujutsu, versus Gojo Satoru, the self-proclaimed strongest of the modern era, and a sorcerer with the ridiculous abilities that we had only seen the beginnings of. From nearly the manga's inception, Gojo vs Sukuna had been set up to be one of the best things that this manga could offer. Just about every fight, every statement, every moment dedicated to demonstrating their strength contributed to the community's hype and anticipation, as it became harder and harder to decipher who would win, or how a titanic clash between these two characters would even end. With every fight, Gojo showed off more and more of his ideology, his limitless curse technique, his ingenuity, his creativity, his confidence, and his cool-headedness in fights. Sukuna showed off his ruthlessness, his cold and calculated approach to battle, his mastery over sorcery, and his own complete faith in his abilities. The inviolability given to Gojo by the Limitless put many fans in Gojo's corner. The experience in godlike domain expansion put many people in Sukuna's. And regardless of what you believed would happen or who you believed should win, the table was set. The build-up for Gojo versus Sukuna was long and arduous, but it was a slow burn that was absolutely necessary for the impact that was seemingly intended on Gege's parts. And then chapter 221 dropped. In this chapter, Gojo is unsealed. He meets Sukuna for the first time since he incarnated into Megumi's body, and the date for their fight was set: December 24th, the anniversary of Suguru Geto's death, the day that is considered to be the most romantic or love-focused in Japanese culture. Initially, I, along with many of the community, read this moment as Gojo being considerate to Geto, wanting to bury his body on the day that he actually died, but as we'll get into later in this video when I start discussing the themes and general overtones of the fight, Gojo vs Sukuna is a conflict that places love and lowliness at its forefront. Even Kenjaku makes note of Gojo's strange decision here, so I just want you to keep in mind this idea for later, as it's going to be extremely important to the overall discussion surrounding their battle when we get into the character and thematic work. Once again, Gege had continued to build this fight even further, calling back to Yuji's question in chapter 3 and having Gojo answer in the same way he did back then. All that was left was for them to actually fight. In between the discussion of the fighting date and the actual opening move, one chapter of minor preparations are covered for both sides of this conflict. Sukuna gets back to around his 20-finger full power. Gojo gets his affairs in order with Shoko and Ijichi, and we are left with nothing to do but see them go at it. And we officially do in chapter 223. Gojo's 200% hollow purple, the opening move that decided the challenger supposedly. The move that showed us that Gege had no intentions of making this on the scale of any other JJK fight we'd witnessed before. Now, you may wonder why I've spent so much time building up to the fight, and that's very understandable considering this is a complete breakdown of Gojo versus Sukuna. However, the reason for that is rather simple. This is not some random fight. These are not two previously non-existent characters just going at it with no surrounding context. Their prior interactions, previous fights, character, ideals, and themes all play a massive part not only in the assumptions made by the fan base, but also the execution of the fight itself on Gege's part. Because it's important in painting how I approach discussing this fight in general, I'll come right out and say it. I don't think that this fight is perfect. It's not even my favorite fight in the manga personally, as I see many flaws or drawbacks that withhold it from being that, but I do want to make one thing clear. While it would have been great for Gojo versus Sukuna to be the best fight in the series so far, and while I may have even hoped for that at some point in my journey with JJK, I am not in the slightest bit dissatisfied with the complete results. I think Gege did an amazing job, all things considered. That being said, I'm also not someone who thinks that this fight is perfect or easily the best content we've seen in JJK, so the critiques and complaints I will proceed to give in this next segment of the video come neither from a scorned, bitter fan's perspective, nor from someone completely devoted to this match and devoid of any problems. It's important to know my overall stance on this fight going into it, as that may color how you see my interpretation of this fight, so simply take what you find helpful in my evaluation of it and ditch the rest. Build-up and anticipation is still a fundamental aspect of writing nevertheless, so making note of it before diving into the other aspects of the fight is extremely integral to setting the scene and giving you guys the proper context and knowledge that we all had going into it subconsciously. And speaking of which, it's time we dive into the fight itself, specifically Gojo versus Sukuna on a technical level. A fight in manga is typically made good or bad depending on a few key qualities. You have the build-up, which we discussed leading up to this, but you also have the character writing quality, the thematic tie-ins, the choreography, and the technical aspect of the fight. Although this last one mainly applies to series with a somewhat complex power system like Jujutsu Kaisen. Other series that fall in a similar category are manga like Hunter x Hunter and JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, series that are very reliant on power systems or previously established abilities interacting with each other in a very meaningful and, more importantly, structured way. Now, I may have some issues with Gege's approach to the choreo and even explanation of some specific concepts in this fight, but on a purely technical and visual level, I want to give props to the entire fight, but more specifically chapter 224, which is really the first time we get to see Gojo versus Sukuna go at it in hand-to-hand combat. This, honestly, is such a good tone-setting chapter in many ways, and I think I will always appreciate Gege for taking the time to just give us one chapter removed from dense explanations and new concepts and simply allowing for previously explained or demonstrated abilities to speak for themselves here. The peanut gallery that is introduced later in this fight has nothing to say in this chapter, and even though their commentary is very enjoyed in certain moments and even integral for the reader wholly understanding what's going on in others, I can't deny that this chapter has some of the best flow throughout their entire fight because it's just hands and techniques with no need to explain what's going on. Visually speaking, Gege conveys every bit of somewhat ambiguous information given to us in this chapter, and it just makes a sequence that is very inconsequential to the main outcome of the fight feel very significant and very powerful. Gojo uses blue to avoid Sukuna's punches at unique angles, sends him flying through buildings with it, and just generally uses this technique to manipulate space in ways that maybe haven't been shown explicitly by Gojo yet, but can be understood by fans who paid close attention to his abilities before this. Sukuna in response uses basic cursed energy manipulation, dismantle his environment, and domain amplification to get a hold of Gojo here. And once again, Gege puts the onus on the reader to parse through the action to completely understand what's going on, and I greatly appreciate that. Starting off a fight like this with a bang is important, which he did with the 200% hollow purple, but keeping the momentum going with the two strongest going back and forth with close quarters combat was an extremely smart decision on Gege's part. It establishes creativity and mastery of their techniques for both characters, and in a sense, it's pretty rewarding to be able to go through this scuffle simply looking at everything that Gege had built for us prior to this. Now, this very free-flowing structure that relies almost purely on the viewer's prior knowledge and ability to understand based on context established beforehand disappears in the following chapters and doesn't come back to full form until the second round of this fight. However, the storytelling style not being as free isn't inherently a bad thing. This fight is very technical, and in some instances there are hard rules or facts of the power system and the characters that we need handed to us by those who have an in-world understanding of what's going on. Yuta making note of Sukuna's massive well of cursed energy, Kashimo commenting on his cursed energy manipulation skill, and even Gojo and Sukuna's brains burning out from RCT spam are all pretty good examples of Gege using this tool with efficiency. All of these things are uncharted territory, both for the characters involved and the readers. So specifically with the RCT plot point, Having multiple points of perspective outside of the battle to explain to us what is going on here is really smart. Gojo specifically doesn't really understand the consequences of smashing and forcefully fixing his brain that many times. And while Sukuna contributes to giving an explanation, having a doctor RCT expert back up his idea adds credence to it, and it makes sense within the context of the world that Shoko specifically would be the main one to speak up here, or the one who would contribute to this conversation the most. There are plenty of examples like this sprinkled throughout the entire battle, and in moments like these, Gege does show off a particular grasp of his power system when diving into this. But oftentimes, it's not so much that this information isn't helpful or even needed, it can just be awkward to cut away from the action to get information or speculation from characters completely removed from the heat of battle. It's not even so much that it's bad, rather, sometimes it would simply be more fitting for Gojo or Sukuna themselves to be the ones expositing this information to us, rather than it be Yuta, Kusakabe, Mei, Maki, Kashimo, or whoever else decided to speak up and give their input. The main reason that this is the case is because cutting away from Gojo and Sukuna's battle to give information just gives us less time to be informed on the character's very specific style of thinking and approach to combat. In a character writing sense, this decision can also be somewhat detrimental, but we'll revisit that in a bit. The argument I'm making here exactly is this. Gojo and Sukuna are close enough in combat ability that every move they make matters. Every thought they have, every doubt that crosses their mind, every bit of information that they can glean from the other is important, not only in making the battle swing in their favor, but in informing us, the audience, as to why they are going to make the move that they choose to make. That added psychological element missing from both characters is an aspect of this battle that I mainly have issues with in chapter 225 and 226, because I view this as Gege's least effective utilization of these characters observing the battle. Hisoka versus Chrollo was actually a pretty good example of what I think Gege could have done a little bit more with Gojo versus Sukuna. Because Chrollo is consistently throwing new techniques and nen abilities and lies and deceit at Hisoka, we actually get to be in his mind and see the way he thinks in a very logical sense, and that is very informing of his character, and it also makes the conclusion of this fight make a lot more sense for both of them. Gege didn't have to follow this blueprint to a T. However, it does seem to be a pretty tried and true method of expositing information in a fight as big as this, so I do think it would have helped. Now, in spite of any potential redundancy that there may be, it's completely undeniable that in a vacuum, completely devoid of any of the context I was bringing up before, it is really cool to see JJK characters discussing and dissecting a fight the same way that the fan base does. At many points in the battle, these characters are basically just power scaling, and as a pretty big fan of that myself, I really did like that vibe being added into this conflict. The placing of it might be slightly problematic or just a little bit intrusive at times, but the concept isn't, and it lands just about as much as it doesn't. Whether this is simply how Gege always intended for the students and other sorcerers to commentate on this fight, or this is some super meta jab from him to the audience, I'm not sure, but it's still very cool in theory nonetheless. There is a lot of rehashing of information for the sake of catching certain characters up to speed, and it's not the worst thing in the world. Like, honestly, it isn't that big of a deal because of how quickly it passes in most cases, but knowing Gege's very brisk writing style, it would have been more effective to dedicate those pages to something a bit more essential. For example, we already have pretty explicit knowledge of domain amplifications, so I'm not really sure we needed to go over it again with two relatively dense pages, but I want to acknowledge that this specific criticism is nitpicking and not much more. In this isolated incidents, the rehashing of old information can be overlooked, but this happening multiple times throughout the fight on a semi-consistent basis is what makes this would-be nitpick issue a genuine problem, at least when you're reading it on a week-to-week basis. Anywho, I have some minor problems here and there with Gege's decision to use the onlookers in the way that he does, but there are definitely positive uses for them that add dimensionality to our understanding of the power system and specific understanding of Gojo and Sukuna's ability. It's also extremely important for the development of characters like Yuta, Yuji, Maki, Hikari, etc., etc. While that specific part doesn't necessarily add to Gojo versus Sukuna now, I'll explain why Gege deciding to flesh out the character's perspective on sorcery a little bit more here actually was a double-edged sword, being both a good and bad decision depending on your perspective. One thing I will say that really rubbed me the wrong way, and still does actually when I think about it, is the fact that no one told Gojo that Sukuna's domain had an open barrier. Call me crazy, but I find it genuinely genuinely insane that neither Yuji nor Choso were relaying the fact that Sukuna's domain was open to Gojo, because he was able to counterattack once he was aware of this fact, but he probably lost a needless amount of stamina because it caught him off guard in the first place. I only really bring it up because I remember it really annoying me the week the chapter dropped, and also because it's pretty convenient for Gojo to not get that information delivered or shared with him when going up his greatest opponent yet. Gege could give us an explanation after the fact, but as of right now, it does feel a little strange for that information not have been passed along. Still, I think I've talked about the character's contribution to the technical aspect of the fighting enough. Now, aside from the aforementioned problems this portion of this fight has, the domain expansion segment of Gojo versus Sukuna is pretty technically sound. It makes logical sense that the two characters who stand at the pinnacle also rely on the pinnacle of sorcery to get rid of one another or do significant damage, so Gojo's usage of anti-domain techniques and his ingenuity when using RCT to heal his technique was really cool and added to the technique burnout concept we'd seen in the series before, overall making this first round pretty good when approaching it from a power system perspective. Gojo and Sukuna come off as very intelligent and honestly broken fighters as they should here, and the continuous cycle of adaptation and adjustments on both sorcerers' ends went on just long enough to be fulfilling, but not so long as to drag out that badly. From a weekly reader's perspective, I can totally understand a fan kind of being over it in the midst of this conflict, and I don't want to invalidate that stance at all. I will just say that in a continuous smooth reading experience, this problem is glossed over pretty nicely, so while liking it and thinking it left a little to be desired pacing wise are both valid stances, your mileage may vary. I could get into hyper-specific examples of Gege using previously established yet vague concepts to add aha moments for fans, and while there are plenty of them to choose from, I will just mention the one that stuck out the most to me in this round. Gojo counteracting Sukuna's outside slashing techniques by shrinking the external barrier of his domain and flipping it is genuinely genius writing from the perspective of the power system. The main thing that impressed me about this specific adjustment is the fact that it plays on the audience's knowledge about domain sizes being inconsistent both outside and in, then simply takes that previously established idea to its logical extreme, having Gojo make an implicit binding vow that lowers the range he can cover outside in exchange for a strengthened barrier. I honestly love it when mangaka tie everything together like this, and Gege does that pretty often when Sukuna and Gojo were spamming their domains at each other. This formula has yet another variable added to the equation once Mahoraga is summoned for the first time and disables Infinite Void. Now, I know the stigma surrounding Mahoraga and Sukuna's usage of him. Trust me, I've seen it more times than I'd like to, but regardless of whether or not you think it's a dirty play or fraudulent decision on Sukuna's part, the win con for both Sukuna and Gojo changes from killing the other within their domain to both being unable to even open one in the first place, and Gojo needing to eliminate Sukuna before he properly takes on the burden of adaptation and summons Mahoraga once more to adapt to infinity. From this point on, we get a pretty heavy focus on Gojo and Sukuna going back and forth in close quarters, changing up the status quo and breathing life back into this fight. For weekly readers, this breath of life was much more essential than I expect binge reading this fight will feel, but no matter what, if Gege had stayed stagnant in conveying the action, the battle would have gotten stale eventually. Gojo versus Sukuna continues Mahoraga-less for about 2 chapters, and Gege switches things up once again for basically the last time. Now, don't misunderstand, I'm not saying this is the last twist in the fight, it's actually very far from it, but it's more like this is the last major pendulum swing. The fight in a technical sense can be split generally into pre-domain and post-domain, considering that is the first and second round established in the manga, although I'd make a distinction between post-domain in general and post-Mahoraga summoning, simply because Sukuna deciding to bring him out in the end is what won him the fight, and it's also what partially pressed Gojo so much all throughout the final portion of it. Now, when speaking purely about Gege's execution of demonstrating Sukuna and Gojo's abilities, there are some pretty amazing moments in this fight. The domain clashes, Sukuna offsetting damage to Megami, Sukuna's usage of Shikigami techniques without summoning them, and Gojo's use of enchantment to amplify his attacking strength are all amazing, but his unlimited hollow purple usage might be the best sequence out of all of them. Chapter 235 in general was really well executed, primarily because the following moments just fit so well with the previously established functions of cursed energy. Gojo landing multiple black flashes to increase his cursed energy levels, the creation of a max output blue and then launching red towards it to create purple externally, Mahoraga's adaptation backfiring, and Gojo amplifying blue's output after launching it by chanting, all to get an unlimited hollow purple, was just special. You really get a feel as to how cool and intelligent Gojo is in this moment, and every bit of information that went into the sequence was built up to really well. We've known for the longest time now that black flashes increase a person's focus, cursed energy control, and even pushes them to 120% of their potential, so that part of the equation checks out. Purple is simply a combination of lapse and reversal, so while most of the community had no idea it could be applied like this, there's no logical reason that it couldn't be. Mahoraga's adaptation to blue backfiring makes sense since we know it's not affected by its pull anymore, and even the final chant after the fact really moves in stride with what we saw from Gojo in the beginning of the fight. His first move was a hollow purple enhanced by chanting, and so was his last. Truly very poignant on Gojo's part, and I have to commend Gege for writing that sequence so well. Unlike many other aspects of the fight I brought up so far, I don't really have any notes for this chapter technically. Maybe I'd question why Gojo got hurt from purple in the first place considering he has infinity, but it's possible that in his super dire state he had to focus entirely on mixing red and blue and couldn't apply his technique in all of these ways at the same time. Regardless, great moment from Gojo and great moment for the fight. There are tons of other technically and intelligently impressive moments that come from both Sukuna and Gojo in this fight, and rereading this fight really shows you how much of a masterclass both of these characters were putting on when you remove the Sukuna hate goggles. But up to chapter 235, the unlimited hollow purple and everything that was required to set that up was probably some of the craziest display of sorcery we have seen and that the world may ever see. This was thought by many to be the conclusion as well, but Gege had other plans. As of chapter 236, it seems that Gojo Satoru is dead and that Sukuna was able to cleave through him. While I did enjoy what I'm assuming to be the conclusion of this fight in chapter 236 as a whole, Gege's explanation of how Sukuna was able to cut through infinity did leave a little bit to be desired, not in terms of content, but in terms of delivery. And that's sort of a running theme with him at times. It's not that the techniques that he uses in the story are always that convoluted, although they can be that at times as well. It's just that Gege often goes for the most technical and jargon-filled explanation possible, which can confuse fans. The Mahoraga adaptation portion makes complete sense to me. In fact, it was established a bit earlier in this fight that Mahoraga's process for analyzing and adapting to phenomena is a complete unknown. Kusakabe and Yuji discussed a potential binary for how it adapts, and Kashimo even said that discussing it is irrelevant because of the possibility for both or neither being the case. So Mahoraga continuously adapting and getting more efficient with it as it takes hits makes sense, and it follows things that we've seen it do before. What I have a problem with, or rather what I'm not too certain of my feelings towards, is Sukuna being able to replicate this form of adaptation to cut Gojo. Basically, Sukuna changed his target to not be Gojo Satoru, but the space that he resides in, and that doesn't not make sense, right? It's just a little strange that we didn't get the implication that Sukuna was working to do this before. If you've read Bleach and you were like me, you may have noticed that Sukuna's slashes now work very similarly to Lilibaro's X-axis. Rather than attacking a person in particular, the effect seems to be cutting everything in between point A and point B, meaning that Sukuna didn't neutralize the limitless, he made a slash that would simply travel the infinite distance required to hit Gojo. This is fine as an ability, but once again this feels sudden. Now, that comment in and of itself isn't entirely true, because earlier in this fight it was alluded to that Sukuna can pull off some insane applications of Jujutsu just by observing someone do something once. Angel implies that even if Sukuna wasn't able to heal his technique using RCT before this fight, Gojo showing that off to him would make it possible for him to do it as well. And she also makes clear that Sukuna was able to become a cursed object at will after Kenjaku demonstrated that ability just once. In theory, it's not crazy that Sukuna could replicate Mahoraga's adaptation depending on what exactly it required to do. So this isn't a thing that he did with no buildup, but I certainly can sympathize with fans who do think it was strange or even straight up convenient for him to develop this technique this late into the fight. Now, while I can sympathize with those fans and even agreed with them on my initial read, the breadcrumbs were certainly present, and you can tell if you go over the fight with a fine-tooth comb. In the beginning of the fight, Sukuna says that he intends to strip Gojo of his scales, which obviously refers to his abilities in general. From the jump, Sukuna is telling both Gojo and the reader exactly what he intends to do. Before he kills him, he plans on breaking down each and every one of his abilities, starting with his domain. We get to see this as during the domain battle, it's clear that even when Gojo adapted to Sukuna's attacking strategy, he always had the upper hand, implying that he was able to see everything that Gojo pulled off as a possibility. Even getting hit with Infinite Void, while not the most convenient thing for his plans, didn't necessarily net him a loss. When peering deeper into the fight, it's clear to see that Sukuna was lying in wait for Mahoraga to not simply adapt to infinity, but for it to show him something very specific, something that we now know was a blueprint blueprint that he could follow. Furthermore, the fact that Sukuna only felt tension after Gojo's cursed energy rebounded after landing multiple black flashes implies that up to this point he still felt in control. Despite the black flash plus red combo putting him to sleep, despite infinite void disabling his domain, despite all of the things that seemed like major setbacks for Sukuna happening, the only real sequence of events that was beyond his ability to parse was Gojo's unlimited hollow purple, which in the end was the attack that nearly killed him. I understand the feeling of it being sudden. I felt the same way on a first read as well, but Gege has actually done an amazing job of all of this being built up to. Now, this doesn't mean he's perfect by any means, nor does it mean that the fight is. In fact, I think it's about time we talk about the thematic, narrative, and character portion of this battle, which is simultaneously home to some of the most and least impressive parts of this bout. Narratively, this fight is a pretty mixed bag. On the one hand, we have some pretty spectacular character moments for both Gojo and Sukuna. We have recurring ideas and concepts brought back and recontextualized, and because of the recency of this fight seemingly ending, it's impossible to fully comprehend what the long-term ramifications of this fight are going to be on the story. All of these things are good and worth discussing. However, that doesn't mean that this fight doesn't leave something to be desired on the character side of things. My biggest criticism, specifically of how this fight is executed, is that Gojo versus Sukuna lacked the aura, the presence, the impact that some other amazing fights in the series had. And while I'll get to talking about that and the prevalent themes of love and loneliness that I told you to remember earlier, I want to start this segment off by being positive because there is a lot to like. For example, all of the back and forth character talk that we did get in this fight was pretty good, and it fit both Gojo and Sukuna's personalities very well. The opening move deciding the challenger, Sukuna comparing Gojo to a fish on his cutting board, the playful attitude in regards to taking responsibility for the damage to the city, the domain do-overs, and so many more specific scenes in this fight give us a very real glimpse into the two strongest characters' personalities when facing a relative combatant. Prior to this, we'd only ever seen both characters steamroll their opponents, making their confident persona interesting, but not really tested or tempered by hardship. But for Gojo to want to flex in front of his students before punching Sukuna in the face, or Sukuna having the gall to call Gojo an ordinary guy after their domain clashes, speaks to just how genuinely both of these characters believe their own hype. It speaks to the authenticity of their ideals and outlooks on combat, and I can respect that wholeheartedly. There's more I have to say regarding that, but for now, I will only sing its praises. What we got was really good in the shit-talking department, and it's what you would expect from these two guys specifically. A very controversial decision on Gege's part, but one that does exist to further inform us on their respective characters, is his decision to have Gojo and Sukuna approach this battle with pretty different mindsets. The way I see it, Gojo went into this fight hoping to have fun and reach Sukuna, drawing him away from the lonely place that being strong places you in. It's not that he didn't want to or plan to win, it's just that that wasn't his only motivation, and potentially it wasn't the one that was driving him deep down. This interpretation would be very consistent with Nanami's input on Gojo in chapter 236, in fact. Gojo was never in it for the sorcery or for the sake of saving others, it was because he enjoyed it, at least from Nanami's perspective. Now, this line has stirred up some controversy amongst the community, and much of the discussion I've seen surrounding it lacks the nuance that it deserves to be broached with. But in short, Gojo is a multifaceted character, a human being within the story. His characterization leading up to this fight with Sukuna was that of a dutiful, strong, invincible sorcerer who would always somehow survive, and in the end, be the ones to see his students surpass him. This is a part of his character as a matter of fact, but it's not the only aspect of who he is. We see in hidden inventory that Gojo was not like Geto, Megumi, and especially Yuji during his adolescence. He simply was not a person focused on saving people or the well-being of others. He existed largely in part for the sake of himself and the people he cared about. In this fight against Sukuna, Gojo was released from the inhibitions of being only the strongest, of being only a teacher, of being only invincible. Just that he had spent the last 10 years existing in one aspect of himself, in this fight he got to indulge the other side. He got to fight to his heart's content, throw everything he had at someone, and still have an opponent to go up against. For Sukuna, it was definitely fun as well. We know this to be true, but it seems that he had always planned to win more than try. Or rather, I'll put it like this. Just as Ishigori, Kashimo, and Gojo wanted to throw everything they had at an opponent, I don't doubt that Sukuna would enjoy doing that as well. To be completely and utterly engulfed in a battle, not knowing whether you'll live or die, is something that would be pure bliss for meatheads like Gojo and Sukuna. However, Satoru wasn't the character who could do that for him. For as strong as he is, as peerless as the story made him seem up to this point, Gojo couldn't bring Sukuna's full effort to the surface, and it's possible that he knew that he wouldn't be able to from the jump. Losing and dying are one and the same for the King of Curses, and while Sukuna commends Gojo for his performance and vows to never forget him, he is still the victor. he is the one who remains lonely because of his power. Now, I think this is a very fitting and satisfying conclusion to their fight conceptually, even in most of the ways it's executed. But the controversiality of it all comes from Sukuna's fighting style leading up to this point, and once again, Gege has left me with a very mixed bag, which in all honesty might be the thematic through line of this video at the moment, just mixed feelings all the way through. The obvious controversy comes mainly from Sukuna relying pretty heavily on the 10 shadows through his fight against Gojo, yet the narrative and Gojo himself is heavily pushing the idea that Sukuna was not only holding back, but also could have possibly won without Mahoraga. From what I've observed from both the fanbase and in my rereads of this fight, this problem is neither wholly delusion or wholly a writing problem, rather being a bit of both. For starters, it's pretty absurd to assume that Sukuna, who hasn't revealed the secrets of his own innate technique, only has what he showed to us in Shibuya. Call me whatever you want, but I find this idea to be a rather silly notion. It's obvious that we're going to get more exploration of what he can do in his next fights, so I'd simply say a lack of patience contributes to this idea that Sukuna is some bum without Mahoraga. That being said, I do think Gege so far has portrayed Sukuna's whole win con to be reliant on the 10 Shadows curse technique. Now, is it possible that the 10 Shadows simply made it easier for Sukuna to bypass Infinity relative to any other move he has? Absolutely, but the onus is on him to demonstrate that either during the fight, or being alright with a bit of skepticism towards Gojo's praise until proven otherwise. But for Gojo fans, I think Sukuna using or heavily relying on the 10 Shadows here is actually a really important thing, and it helps portray Gojo as a very strong, prominent character despite losing. Many people seem to be extremely upset at that, but if Gojo was destined to lose, wouldn't you rather Sukuna have to use an ability that he didn't have before? Doesn't that only make Gojo's legacy stronger now? Anyways, rhetorical question aside, outside of that specific complaint, the Fraudkuna jokes are just that. They're jokes, both in a literal sense and as critiques of his character. Sukuna clearly does not ascribe to a sense of morality, justice, or honor system, or else he wouldn't have slaughtered dozens of people in Shibuya, tormented Yuji as much as possible for no reason, and immediately spawned into the world after a long time, yearning to kill women and children. I can't believe I even have to say this, but Sukuna isn't a good guy. Not using good guy tactics is kind of his whole thing. Gojo opened this fight by getting assistance from his allies. Reggie called sorcerers con artists. Toji wore Gojo down before attacking him with a weapon that specifically countered his abilities. None of these characters are generally considered lesser than because of this, and neither should Sukuna. Point blank period. He made use of his resources, he made use of his abilities, and he got the win. Did he fight dirty in this battle? I mean, maybe, depending on your definition of that. But considering the fact that this isn't a UFC or boxing match, and the fact that it's a literal fight for the fate of the world, I think I can let dirty fighting slide a little bit. Now, before we get into one of my biggest gripes with the character writing for this fight, I want to say this. The idea of Yorozu's speech about strength and the isolation it brings coming back into play is something I spotted in chapter 221. And I'm not saying I'm special for that, but low-key I'm special for that. I made a video a few months back talking about this concept, why it makes sense for Sukuna to have this kind of dynamic with Gojo, blah, 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 blah. And for the most part, I was pretty spot on. The main thing I was incorrect about was Gojo being the one to save Sukuna from his isolation, when in actuality, it was the other way around. Despite this, it makes complete sense for both of their characters, and I'd argue that since the Culling games, Gege has been building up this theme in a pretty obvious fashion. A strong character looking to assuage their feelings of hunger by fighting someone that truly makes them dedicate their body and soul to the experience. Well, maybe I'm crazy, but that sounds exactly like Ryu Ishigori and Hajime Kashimo, two characters introduced in the Culling Game saga, and two characters who coincidentally will have both fought Sukuna soon enough. This is no accident. And even having Sukuna's first real fight with Megami's body be against Yorozu, whose whole conceptualization is based on the theme of love, is also not something that Gege didn't plan for. Hell, even in Volume 0, love is determined to be the greatest curse of all, and while I doubt Gege had everything planned out since then, I would wager that slowly but surely he's been building to this theme, with it materializing concretely at the start of the Culling games at the latest. Conceptually, this idea is pretty engaging. Thematically, it's consistent, and in terms of execution, I can't complain or want more. Gege did an excellent job with this narrative throughline. Unfortunately, I can't entirely say the same when it comes to character writing. More specifically, dialogue between these two during a majority of their fight. Listen, I'm a pretty simple guy at the end of the day. I see two of the most proud, strong, and charismatic characters in the series fight, and I want to indulge in the dialogue, the shit talking, the hypothesizing, the respective and back and forth. I want it all. I want bars on top of bars on top of bars. And in some capacity, this fight did give that to us. But I'm gonna take Gojo's advice and be greedier, because a fight that is already mostly good with some flaws here and there could have been elevated several spots higher in my ranking and several points higher in my rating of this battle if Gege put his foot into the dialogue the same way he has with other fights. Throughout this video, I've said many things that people watching this are sure to disagree with, but this might be my hottest take yet. Kashimo versus Akari, Yuta versus Sendai, Yuji versus Mahito, and even more minor fights like Sukuna versus Jogo or Megumi versus Reggie had consistently more personality and vigor to them than this fight did, and that's a damn shame. It doesn't mean that Gojo versus Sukuna is inferior to all of the fights mentioned, although I would argue it's not #1 on this list either. My critique very specifically here speaks to a lack of that charismatic flair that makes JJK fights so memorable. There's no just this once, or sheer lethality, or you're immortal but I'll kill you anyway, or there are shadows above you too, or I'm you level bars in this fight. It isn't devoid of any bangers per se, but this fight could have seriously been elevated if much of the peanut gallery's discussion were relegated to Gojo and Sukuna's thoughts and mind games thrown back and forth. It's not even like Gege didn't know how to write these interactions either. He teases us with dialogue like this sparsely throughout the fight numerous times, but he doesn't commit to the bit and double down all the way through. And this is why earlier in the video I mentioned how useful the commentary can be in some instances while being absolutely annoying in others. Sometimes it's cool to hear Kusakabe speak on Gojo versus Sukuna, but at other times I just want to see these two characters talk it out themselves. Gojo and Sukuna are the stars at this moment, and I would have really loved to be immersed in their minds even more during this fight because of that. It's not the end of the world by any means, and as I'll discuss when I give my overall thoughts on the fight's purpose in totality, there are some justifications you can give when hearing this critique, but I won't lie and pretend that I genuinely don't believe this fight would have been made better if it had quadrupled the amount of bars and personality that it currently has. It almost makes the conclusion of the fight weaker because of how little that energy we get beforehand, but I won't take it that far. Rather than actively weakening the quality of the fight, Gege choosing not to indulge in that specific potential for their interactions simply inhibited its upwards potential. But I've discussed this battle in its current form to the best of my ability, so for this final segment, I'll be addressing any loose ends that didn't fit in earlier portions of the discussion, my overall thoughts regarding this fight as a whole, and how the future of Jujutsu Kaisen could severely increase or decrease the quality of this fight moving forward. Gojo versus Sukuna is a really good fight. Accounting for all of my criticisms and negative experiences with this battle, both in a weekly and binging context, I'd still be willing to stand on that take because of how solid the foundation is, and the fact that 70 to 80% of the execution for this battle is basically flawless in my mind, with the next 20 to 30% being a little bit more in question. The character writing was a bit undercooked, the conclusion slightly abrupt, and the weekly experience sometimes grueling, but I'd be lying to myself if I said that Gege didn't make a damn good fight here. It's by far not the best fight that the series has to offer, and by the end of the story I doubt it'll even be the best fight that Sukuna participates in, but in that conclusion lies much of my ambivalence towards this fight moving forward. If Gege was using Gojo versus Sukuna more as a training lesson or demonstration of peak sorcery for the sake of the next generation, and he's able to properly show Gojo's impact on each and every one of his students, this fight will have done its job and my appreciation for it will only grow. I know it's a tough pill to swallow for some, especially Gojo fans considering what you guys lost, but I wager that this fight was never meant to be a completely conclusive battle. Gojo's role on a meta level was never that important. Just as he had been trapped within his world to the role of teacher, from a writing perspective, that's what Gojo was always meant to be. A teacher, someone to mentor the next generation and make them surpass him. He was only able to release himself from this prison in death. The next generation will step up to the plate, but these next few chapters and character arcs will be absolutely essential, because as of right now, it is on Gege to show Gojo's impact very explicitly, so that the sacrifice of his character was not in vain. All we can do now is wait and see, but currently I'm willing to say that Gege did a rather good job with Gojo versus Sukuna. I have my complaints, and I'm sure you have yours, so let me know down in the comments your thoughts on this fight as of chapter 236. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for sticking around, and I'll see you in the next one.